Microsoft dropped its earnings, but are the Xbox numbers good or bad? And I don't mean like good or bad, like, hey, that's some sort of catchy intro. I mean, like, depending on how you look at them, you could either kind of be like optimistic and say, look, these are fine. This is what we would expect. Or pessimistic and be like, well, Xbox is doomed. Now, Xbox is not doomed. I will spoil that for you before we even get started. But let's just dive into the numbers and let's just dive into it. So Xbox content and services revenue increased 62%. Now, on the surface, 62% revenue increase, that is like gangbuster numbers. That would be phenomenal. However, it was driven by 61 points of net impact from the Activision acquisition. So what the heck does that mean? It means that without Activision, Xbox basically would have been flat when it comes to Xbox content and services revenue, which again, I will remind you, is what Microsoft says, please judge us on, not total gaming revenue. However, we can't ignore all the numbers that Microsoft provides. So digging a bit closer into the earnings information that they dropped, they said gaming revenue grew 51%, including, again, 55 points of net impact from Activision. Xbox content and services revenue, as I already said, 62%, and Xbox hardware revenue declined 31%. Now, of all those numbers, the Xbox hardware declining revenue, that is probably the most logical one. You're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, hey, the console's not exactly new. You're continuing to see lower price points if they do any deals or anything else like that. The bundles, those cut down on everything. And so hardware declining isn't all that surprising. Maybe with the diskless version of the Series X that we're expecting in the fall, we'll see some rebound, but however, at this time, revenue is down. And keep in mind, revenue is not how many consoles that were sold, it's the amount of money that was made. So you could theoretically sell, if you sold 1 million consoles for $1, you would still see a revenue decline in this scenario. So just kind of keep that in mind in the back of your head. So when you kind of look at the overall picture, because one of the big deals was with the last quarter is like, hey, gaming was actually the third largest business inside of Xbox. However, as you can see from their latest earnings release, they're actually down to number 4. Now, they've jumped a lot since acquiring Activision, and they're just below I suspect for a while we'll see them ping pong between 3rd and 4th. Like that just kind of feels like where it's going to be until some of those gaming subscriptions start growing in like a meaningful capacity, and then it potentially will supersede Windows permanently. But as of right now, Windows had actually a pretty strong quarter in itself, and so gaming is now the 4th largest in the world, of Xbox at the end of the day. And so that's not all the information that Microsoft shared. Before we kind of dig into some analysis, they have their earnings call, which just wrapped up about an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, where Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said, hey, look, we are doing okay. They actually saw pretty significant impact. He said, we set 3rd quarter records for game streaming hours, console usage, and monthly active devices. Now, that is a pretty loaded statement because what is a monthly active device? Is it just consoles? Is it does it include cloud gaming? It doesn't matter. It's a figure that Microsoft won't ever sort of peel back the onion layers on whatever it is. But streaming hours, which obviously is likely cloud gaming, console usage is a pretty big deal because that means more people are spending more time on their console during this last quarter, which is obviously a notable thing, primarily for Game Pass, right? Because if people are spending more time on their console, they're maybe getting bored of their game, they want to dip into something else. Game Pass is the strategic advantage there. Now, for the quarter and month or 3 months ahead, although we're kind of we're already in the Q2 calendar year, Q4 fiscal year for Microsoft. Microsoft actually expects Xbox content and services will grow in the high 50s with 60 points of net impact of Activision Blizzard. Overall gaming revenue in Q4 will grow to low to mid 40s with 50 points from ABK. Effectively, what that means, if it wasn't for ABK, things would be down, right? ABK is an outsized contributor, or outsized, if you will, right? They paid nearly $70 billion. It better darn well be. And so basically, ABK is sort of propping things up from the year-over-year capacity. And so, yeah. And this is where things start to get interesting because the question becomes, is like, Brad, was this a good quarter for Xbox or was it a bad quarter for Xbox? Well, you can kind of parse it a couple different ways because, again, revenue increased 62%. How is that not a positive thing? However, as I've already noted, 61% of that growth was because of ABK being now under the portfolio. Microsoft effectively bought their own growth. They paid $70 billion to get 62% of growth this quarter. Gaming revenue also increased 51%, which again is massive numbers on the surface. But on the pessimistic side, without Activision, Xbox was really flat at best, or you could even argue it had about a 4% decline when you back out all the Activision stuff. So, it just kind of depends on what headline do you want, because you can certainly frame this in a very positive and optimistic way, which Microsoft clearly took that because that's their route and that's their company and that's what they're intended to do. But if you want to be like, Xbox is dead, then you got to be like, look, they didn't grow at all. They actually shrunk year over year. And then you slap in ABK and it's like, yeah, they grew, but only artificially. So again, things are ebbing and flowing. And I think part of the reason why is actually we haven't seen a lot of ABK titles make it their way into Game Pass. We really just started seeing Diablo 4. Diablo 4 is the first big title that was really in Game Pass, so we'll be curious to see if we see any growth from that for the subscription side. But at the end of the day, they've really been right. They just closed this massive deal. There's been some cuts, there's been some trimming, and so they're still kind of operating like these siloed entities because they haven't completely merged all of the business infrastructure or business planning or business roadmaps, if you will, from a Game Pass perspective, which again, I will remind you is what Microsoft says. Please judge us on that. So here's the other interesting question, or not even question, but observation, if you will. Actually, the net impact of the Activision acquisition was actually drug down Microsoft's overall earnings just a little bit. But overall, because again, there's a lot of costs tied up and everything going through here. You got to look at cost of capital and all sorts of stuff. And at the end of the day, it was actually a net negative overall when you look at the entire company, Activision. Now, obviously, it was a net positive for Xbox, but just something to keep in mind. And here's an interesting chart. Here's an interesting chart. Not that one. Hit the wrong button there. Is that Microsoft's major product lines? So you can kind of see, from a visual perspective, and this is from Todd Bishop on Twitter, or X or whatever it's called this week. And you can kind of see the breakout of the revenue. Yes, you knew that Windows and Xbox are sort of teetering back and forth between third and fourth or whatever. But when you look at it from an overall perspective, Azure or their cloud infrastructure is at the top there, and it is bigly ahead. Then you have Office, another notable product in the Microsoft portfolio. Those two are significantly ahead. And then you have basically the other. Xbox and Windows are, slightly in a league of their own at the end of the day. You got Max Verstappen up there, if you're an F1 fan, at the very top. And then it's the rest of the group. Right. And so I don't want to anger anybody else. We'll just say Max is at the top. I will leave it to who's in third and fourth. Charles, I'm not going to go down there. That went way off on a tangent. Either way, you can kind of see how that breaks out. So if somebody said, Brad, was it a good quarter in your opinion? Good question. Good question. I would consider this a relatively neutral quarter. I wouldn't say it was a great one for Xbox, but it's definitely not Xbox is doomed, right? We didn't see any major titles being launched. We didn't see a Starfield come online. We didn't see other things happening. We didn't see a Call of Duty. And so I think it's a pretty neutral quarter. I wouldn't die on the hill this is great for Xbox, but it's definitely not bad for Xbox at the end of the day. They're currently going through this transition of getting Blizzard and all that stuff lined up and trying to figure out that strategy. And that is one thing we haven't really heard much about is hey, what is the Call of Duty plan? What are the rest of the title plans? What does the launch cycle look like now? We have vague ideas on the launch cycle, but more so the Game Pass integration, because again, if Microsoft is saying judge us on Game Pass subscriptions, we're not seeing the aggressive approach, at least yet, from the merger and the acquisition actually taking place. So that is the thing to keep in mind here. The hardware sales being down is potentially concerning. However, keep in mind that they haven't dropped pricing. And so I suspect that Microsoft's in a kind of a pickle here because it's hey, we could juice hardware sales. All we got to do is start dropping pricing. However, if they're not actually profitable on the consoles, which we don't know, but we suspect, let me say it differently. We would hope that by this point in the life cycle at $4.99, Microsoft would be profitable. However, we know that things aren't quite like they were previous generations, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're just break even. I suspect that there's some margin in there. I would tend to think that at this point there would be, but again, let's just say they're making $50 a console. If they drop it $50 or $100, then they're in the negative, and it's ooh, how are they going to drive these sales? Sony's clearly doing like a PS Pro. But again, I don't know if an Xbox Series X Pro is really the right thing, because they just sell hardware to their own users that already have a console and maybe not growing that base like they want to do. So there you go. Those are the numbers as we have received them from Microsoft. So they are official. A little bit of conjecture thrown in there. As always, if you want to stay updated with everything happening in the world of Xbox and beyond, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.